We're in week 3, and so this week we are reading Matthew chapters 11 through 15. And the way that D-Life works is that you have 7 days to read 5 chapters out of the scriptures, and we're in the book of Matthew now. If you're not part of the D-Life virtual group and you're just tuning in for the Bible study, then we will be in Matthew 12 today. And taking our Bible study out of the 12th chapter of Matthew. I'm not going to read the verses tonight because it's really it's quite a few verses. The entire 12th chapter really is the context of what we're dealing with. But I'm going to be referencing some of these sections, and so the references will be on the screen, and you can pause to go back and read it if you haven't gotten to the 12th chapter in your reading this week. I suggest that if you have and you've already read chapter 12, that you go back and take a look at it again in light of our Bible study tonight. The other group Bible studies, the people who are leading discipleship groups, will be in different chapters for their Bible study time. And then Brother Gary and I, when we're preaching on Sunday, we also take a chapter or a passage out of the Bible readings for that particular week. We're getting some good reports back from folks who are in groups or doing the D-Life journal with their families or even on their own. Getting some good reports back and very encouraged by the participation. We're looking for good things to happen as we spend this year in intentional disciple making and learning what the scriptures have to say and how we can respond to it in a very intentional way. So we're glad that you're here, and we're going to be in looking at the first 14 verses of chapter 12. Now, what's happening in chapter 12 starts off with a story of almost an innocuous event, not a very big deal. But it sets off a firestorm of protest and response from the religious leaders, in particular the Pharisees. And this is the beginning of the formal resistance by the religious establishment, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law. This is where, in the Gospel of Matthew, their formal resistance begins to take place. And they begin to respond to Jesus with criticism. They will dog him from now on, all the way up to the crucifixion. They will dog him, and always like dogs and hounds nipping at the heels of their prey. These guys are always there. They're always looking for a reason and they're looking for an opportunity to trip Jesus up. These will be the guys that at Jesus' trial, when he's finally arrested and brought before the Sanhedrin, it's these guys that show up and try to bring accusations about Jesus breaking the law and being a false prophet and those kinds of things. The problem is that they never can seem to be able to build a case against him, because the stuff that they're complaining about is not really Jesus breaking the law. Jesus is challenging their traditions and challenging their religious pride and their minutiae obedience to the law and requiring that of everybody else. He does challenge that, but the Sanhedrin recognizes that that's not really breaking the Mosaic law. That's just making people mad. And he wasn't playing by the rules. He wasn't playing by the established rules. And so it all begins here. And it starts off with a very minor thing. It's really kind of almost a very small matter. It's a Sabbath day, and Jesus is walking along with his disciples, and they've gotten hungry, and so they stop and they see a grain field there, and they stop and they begin to pick some of the heads of grain off of the stalks there. They rub it in their hands, and they begin to eat the chaff that has been removed from the grain. They begin to munch on the grain, on the wheat grain, and having a little bit of a snack. Well, there were the Pharisees that were there walking along with them, and then they just went ballistic. because in their mind the disciples were violating the Mosaic law of not doing any work on the Sabbath. And so we're going to pull our application tonight on their response to this particular incident and what followed in the days ahead, and then what would continue to follow Jesus through the rest of his earthly ministry. My name is Dave Ketchen. I'm the associate pastor here at Old Zion Hill Baptist Church, and we're glad that you've joined us. And I am entitling tonight's Bible study Decision Time. And sooner or later, everybody, whether we're a Christian or not, sooner or later everybody is going to make some kind of a decision as to whether they're going to follow Jesus or not. And we're going to look at some principles here of what it looks like when a person begins to resist. What's it look like when a person does not choose to follow Jesus? And there are three particular things that happened in these first 14 verses of chapter 12 that are actually very, very consistent. The steps, if you want to call them steps, or the process that people will actually begin to go through when they encounter Jesus and they begin to respond to it, and they end up rejecting him for one reason or another. It is actually, if you look at the book of Genesis, at the fall, where Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit, they went through the exact same process that these Pharisees go through in challenging Jesus. So we're going to be comparing, actually, Matthew 12, 1 through 14, to the passage in Genesis where Adam and Eve are tempted to eat of the forbidden fruit, and they experience the fall that got them kicked out of the garden and cast out of the garden. The same three things occurred in sequence in that situation and in this situation, with a little bit of insight thrown in, a little bit of extra insight thrown in these gospel passages. So we're going to begin in Matthew 12, and the first thing that happens, the slide is coming up and says, what does rejecting Jesus look like? That's what we're going to, the question that we're going to be asking. The Pharisees got to the place very, very quickly where they have rejected Jesus. So what does rejecting Jesus look like? What are the things that we go through, a person goes through, when they begin to face the choice of whether to accept Christ as their Savior or to accept Christ as their Lord and follow him in discipleship? It doesn't matter whether a person is saved or lost. There are times when we are faced with encountering Jesus and him being the Lord of our life, where we have the choice of whether we're going to say, yes, I will follow you in this, or no, I won't. Now, the most basic choice is whether to accept Christ as their Lord and Savior or not. But even a person who is a Christian follows these same three principles when they become challenged as to whether they're going to follow or trust Jesus with the lordship of their life. And that's what we're going to be looking at tonight. So, in beginning in verses 1 through 8, the first thing that happens that a person is challenged with when they are in the process of deciding whether they're going to follow Christ or not, I'm calling it suspicion. Now, in the garden, Satan tempted Adam and Eve when Adam and Eve said, God has said that we can eat of any fruit of the tree of the garden except this one, and because if we eat of that fruit on that day, we will surely die. And so Satan tempted them with the principle of suspicion, because he said to them, did God really say that? That's in the book of Genesis. Now, here in Matthew 12, the disciples are walking along, they see a grain field, it's on a Sabbath day, they get some grain field, they shuck it in their hands and they're munching it. And the Pharisees that are watching this, they go, look! That's in verse 3, I think. Look! Your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. Horror of horrors. Okay, they're having a snack. Your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. They are working in their interpretation of this minutia of obeying the laws down to the nth degree. These are the guys, these Pharisees are the guys that tithe everything, for instance. I mean, you know, they down to the spices on their spice rack in their houses, and they do absolutely no work on the Sabbath, because the law said that you're to rest on the Sabbath. And so they were incensed that the disciples were rubbing some grain together to get the grain into a form that they could eat it. And so the suspicion principle is that they are offended by something that Jesus is allowing them to do, or that Jesus' followers are doing, and that causes them to be suspicious of who Jesus is, and whether or not he is the Messiah, or whether or not he is somebody to follow. And so suspicion begins as the first principle. When I'm being tempted to whether I'm going to follow Jesus or not, I'm going to deal with the issue of suspicion. So suspicion can occur in many different ways. In this particular case, the Pharisees were offended, or they were incensed, because they believed that the disciples were doing something that was against the law. In the garden, Adam and Eve were deceived and challenged whether or not God really said what he said or not. We can enter into this principle of suspicion when there is a temptation or a choice to make about whether we're going to follow Jesus or not, based on many things. Sooner or later, every Christian is going to be faced with something about following Jesus that confuses them, or challenges their thinking, or challenges something about the way that they want to live their life. Sooner or later, every Christian is faced with something in their life that Jesus says, I want you to follow me, and it's going to affect whether they can continue to do that particular thing or not. The response to that, the first response to that, is the individual begins to say, well, is that really a big deal? Am I going to do? They begin to have suspicion. Is Jesus out for my best interest? Is he just a cosmic killjoy? Did he really mean that I'm reading? Those kinds of things. Suspicion takes place. Well, Jesus responded to them, and basically he said to the Pharisees, you know, he went into quite a lengthy response to them. But basically, he said, who among you, if you're hungry on the Sabbath, is not going to eat something? Or if your ox got into a ditch, that you wouldn't get him out? Come on, you know, really, okay? But then, all of that discussion ends with a statement where Jesus says, but know this, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, if you were a Pharisee, that would have really ticked you off, okay? That was not the kind of response that they were looking for. So there's suspicion. So then the next thing that happens tends to be investigation. Investigation. The verses 9 through 14. Now at this point the story continues, and Jesus goes into a synagogue. All right, and so he's going to be teaching in the synagogue. So we'll get back to that in just a second. But let's go to Genesis. Adam and Eve, they have been challenged and tempted by Satan to, has God said, did God mean what he said, or has God said anything about eating the fruit of the tree? Well, the next thing Adam and Eve do, they begin to investigate. Now, the investigation is innocent, but the scripture clearly says they saw the tree, they looked at it, and they saw that it was pretty and attractive in appearance, and it was good for food. And so now they're now looking at this tree in a way that they hadn't looked at before, because Satan has tempted them with a suspicion that God's really not out for their good. So here Adam and Eve are investigating. They're investigating the tree. They're investigating the fruit. Looks good for food. And so they're investigating. Now this is what happened back over in Matthew 12. Jesus goes into the synagogue, and it specifically says there in verse 10, a man with a shriveled hand was there, and Jesus heals the old boy. Okay, again on the Sabbath. Now this was really bad stuff. But that passage specifically says they were investigating him now, following him around for the specific purpose that says that they were looking for ways to trip him up. They were looking for fault, and they were looking for accusation that they could bring against him. They asked him, is it lawful to heal them on the Sabbath? Because they were looking for ways to get him in trouble. So now the investigation that they're doing, there has been a suspicion going on. Now the investigation is not an honest investigation. It says clearly here that the Pharisees were looking for a way to accuse him further. They were looking for a way to trip him up. Adam and Eve, they were innocent. It was before sin entered into the world, but they were responding to, when they went and looked at the tree, they were responding to the temptation of Satan. Did God really say? Now they didn't have the sinister motive, because they didn't know what sinister motives were, but still they were investigating. They were giving some adherence or some attention to what Satan had said, and they began to look at the tree. Now in this situation here in Matthew 12, they went into the synagogue looking for a way to find more accusation against Jesus, and they found him healing this guy with a withered hand on the Sabbath. And so and he said, Jesus said, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. It is not unlawful to do good on the Sabbath. Well, that didn't answer their questions either. So the second thing that happens is that there is an investigation. Usually the investigation is not an innocent investigation. I've already got a doubt in my mind. I've already got a suspicion in my mind. And human nature is such that I begin to look for evidence to support my suspicion. Then the third thing happens. Okay, once I'm investigating, I've been suspicious. I'm investigating. Then there is a determination to act, and there's a rejection of Jesus. Now, in the garden, after there was a suspicion, did God really say this? Then Adam and Eve looked at the tree, found it to be attractive and good for fruit. Then they took the fruit and they ate. There was active sin that took place. There was a determination that, well, it must not be that big a deal. We're not told all of the thoughts and the reasonings that went into their process here, but they made a choice. They made a determination to take the fruit and to eat it, and so that was an objective rejection of the instruction of God. Well, the Pharisees, back over in Matthew chapter 12, they are investigating. They're watching Jesus' and disciples. There is suspicion because he's not obeying, or he's not honoring their interpretation and application of the law. And they're now in the synagogue, and they're watching him heal some poor guy with a withered hand. And then Jesus claiming, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. It is not unlawful to do good on the Sabbath. That didn't help his reputation with him at all. But there's an interesting thing in verse 14. At that point, there's a determination made by these guys. Beginning in verse 13, so he said to them, stretch out your hand. So he stretched out it, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. Verse 14, but the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. Now this is fairly early in his ministry, but at this point, these guys, these Pharisees, they've had suspicions. He's not acting right. He's not acting according to their understanding of the law. They've been walking with him, asking him questions, trying to trip him up. They're conducting their investigation with the idea, not of an honest investigation. Their heart's not open to him, but with the evidence that they can come up with that he's blaspheming or he's doing something that he shouldn't be doing, that can be brought a charge against him. So it's not an honest investigation. He continues to violate whatever standards that they think that exist, and they make a determination. And the determination is to reject Jesus as the Messiah. This guy is a blasphemer. They'll call him demon-possessed, and that and they begin to interpret the healings that he does with people. And then they say that he is healing these people by the power of Satan. and calling him Satan himself and those kinds of things. They really begin to reject him based on a determination that he cannot be who he says he is, because he does not fit into our understanding of what the Messiah is going to be. So these chapters that we're reading this week is the kinds of things, the run-ins that he had with these religious leaders and the people, the followers that began to follow him. All these stories are not just disjointed stories. They have a narrative that deals with the growing opposition and how people begin to either accept Jesus, accept his message, and turn and follow him, or they reject him, but by determining in their heart that for whatever standards and whatever reasons that they're coming up with, they are justified in rejecting Jesus and turning away from him. When a person rejects Jesus and turns away from him, then they can rationalize and they can determine any response to Jesus is legitimate because of their rejection of him as the Messiah. 3 principles when we're deciding what does rejecting Jesus look like. It starts off with decision. Sooner or later there's going to be something that happens that we have to make a choice about. Then I'm going to start investigating. But the investigation is usually not an honest investigation. I'm trying to find evidence to uphold my presuppositions. And then there is a determination, a decision on my part that involves rejecting Jesus. It is consistent. It was consistent in the Garden of Eden. It is consistent with the disciples and Jesus as they are relating to the Pharisees. 3 important principles that we need to keep in mind. So each week we talk about making space for Jesus in our life, SPACE. I'm going to put up a slide with the